Welcome to the Storypowers Podcast, the show about the power of stories, the people who tell them, and why you should be doing it too. I'm your host, keynote speaker and storytelling coach, Francisco Mahfuz. My guest today is Dr. Elizabeth Kapu'uwailani Lindsey. Elizabeth is the first Polynesian explorer and female fellow in the history of the National Geographic Society. A native Hawaiian elder, cultural anthropologist, and award winning filmmaker, she travels to the world's most remote regions as a conservationist of indigenous wisdom and an advocate of social, environmental, and cultural justice. She's the recipient of the United Nations Visionary Award, and she has served as an advisor to global organizations, including the Tibet Fund for His Holiness the Dalai Lama. Elizabeth is a former Miss Hawaii. She has delivered 3 TED Talks, and now, in what is surely a highlight of her distinguished career, she's a guest on the Story Powers podcast. Ladies and gentlemen, Elizabeth Lindsey. Elizabeth, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much, Francisco. I've never had such an introduction. That's something. Thank you.
So, that must be the most self-aggrandizing introduction about my show that I've ever read. But it's somewhat inspired by what I consider our very strange our very first initial conversation. So you and I didn't know each other until maybe a week ago, and you reached out to me on social media saying that you were blown away by my work, and because I'm, you know, arrogant and think too much of myself, I thought, of course, my work is fantastic. And then I went and looked at your work, and I thought, wow, this is. I think her mind is going. She's traveled too much now. She's been cooped up because of COVID. This is clearly there's a problem here. So my question to you, and I think this is going to lead us into much of the stuff that I want to talk to you about, is you said that there were a lot of intersections between my work, which my audience will be familiar with, and your work, which they won't. So what were those intersections that you saw?
Well, it's a terrific question. It's a perfect place to start. So, with the cultures that I visit and live with, as you said, in some of the most remote parts of the world, cultures that people have almost never heard of, they see storytelling as the medicine for the world. I mean, they really believe, especially during these times that are filled with so many challenges, that story actually helps us make sense of life and the world around us. And it also helps us make sense of our own lives. So these cultures have taught me that stories are the medicine for the world and the storytellers are the shaman, which I think is very interesting, because then when I came across your post, your initial post, and I thought, who is Francisco? I need to meet him because we are doing very similar work. And yet, you as a storyteller, as a coach, as a host, me as an anthropologist, this is a brilliant intersection for both of us. It's like a complementary, experience for us.
Well, I think that after this conversation, I might just have to add to my list of LinkedIn titles, storytelling shaman. I think I think that will go
Cultures would
down.
applaud you for that.
That will go down well with the business community. I think that's gonna be what seals most deals from now on. Might justify some of the substances as well, but we should leave this for another time. So okay, so you've been to a lot of different places. You've interacted with a lot of different cultures, and I was just trying to figure out what is the correct way to refer to these peoples, to these civilizations, because I think back in the days when we didn't know how horrible we were as human beings, we would call them primitive cultures or something along those lines, which I'm sure would have you climbing up the walls. So, is there a term now to refer to this sort of more ancient or primal civilizations that I'm just
Yes,
not familiar with?
absolutely. Well, they're all native to a place. We're
Mm,
all native to some place. And for them, you know, even the term indigenous, though we use it a lot, is not entirely accurate. They're native to a particular land and a tradition and a society of people. And, it's very interesting because I've heard a lot of people say, well, they're primitive and they're not advanced. And yet their cultural intelligence and wisdom and knowledge are so sophisticated. In many ways, we have a lot to learn from them. So I'm really grateful for the opportunity I've had to travel and live with among these cultures.
Okay, so let me understand let me understand a bit more what sort of experiences you've had when it comes to these types of cultures and storytelling particularly. And I'm coming from a point of view of someone who often when I give keynotes, when I talk to people in workshops, it's one of the most common tropes, perhaps is the word, for talking about storytelling is how, storytelling has been with us for a very long time. This is how people communicated back in the ancient days.
Mm.
But arguably, those civilizations that you have visited, they still are in the ancient days. They haven't changed necessarily as much as we obviously have changed. So how much of that representation of those cultures as massively storytelling cultures, how accurate is that actually, and how much is that just us maybe romanticizing the issue a little
No,
bit?
no, it's not at all. I mean, they very much, the cultures that I've lived with are very steeped in storytelling. And even because they still spend a great deal of time, many of these are oral traditions, so they're primarily, they express their stories through language, through their languages, their songs, their chants, their dances, their music, their poetry, even their food. I mean, everything has a story, and it's just how we define story. But when I go to be with a culture as an anthropologist, my definition is very simple. It's my willingness to bear witness to the world and suspend my own judgments. So when I go to be with them, I'll be very quiet. I don't even start asking questions ever. And for many of these cultures, because they're entrusting me as I come in, but they'll still be reading me like weather conditions. So, for example, I was with an elder who never spoke to me for 3 days, just sat with me and rocked in his chair, never said a word, but the entire time he was reading me. Because, quantum physics supports this, the whole notion that we are made up of waves and particles. So these people navigate in the most sophisticated way, whether they're on the ocean or in the deserts, they're navigating. And what I've learned from them is the same ability for us, you and I can sit there and I can look at your facial expressions and I can listen to your words, but more importantly, I'm listening to the spaces between your words. So these are all parts of navigating. To be able to walk into a boardroom or to work with executives, and you are reading the room and everyone in the room, not only what they're saying, not only their obvious behaviors, but the subtle things, that the subtle cues that they don't even realize they're broadcasting or transmitting. So these people, everything that they do is a story. And every story, I mean, they're very intentional. And what I believe is part of their most sophisticated technology is that they have a heightened state of awareness. So, for example, I lived with sea nomads in the Andaman Sea. These are people who, during the 2004 tsunami, when hundreds of thousands of lives were lost, this small tribe of 2,000 people weren't even injured. And I was fascinated to know why. So I flew, across the world to be with them. And it was not easy to go and live with sea nomads. But you start to understand that their heightened state of awareness and their ability to recognize patterns. I mean, their pattern recognition, and all of this is built upon stories through generations. The dolphins come in during this time of the morning and they rest in shallow waters. So when they see that break in the pattern, they know that this marks, a really important indicator. and or the elders and people that had gone ashore that morning to go and gather food just prior to the tsunami. The elder that was with them realized the birds were not singing, break in a pattern. But you have to understand what the pattern is before you can recognize that there's a break in it. And so all of this is a function of their cultural stories. They know that the birds sing in the forest. They are so intimately uh, wedded to nature that those that were waiting for this group to come back from the island with food were on their boats and saw the dolphins racing and went and followed after them because they knew that there was something wrong. The people that were on the island knew, recognized the birds had stopped singing, so they raced to higher ground. That's how they saved themselves. So, my question as an anthropologist is how do we apply these same methods of awareness, that these same abilities to heighten our awareness, that when we go into meetings that we can read patterns much more masterfully, that we can present much more masterfully. This is the power of storytelling and the application of this kind of cultural intelligence to the modern world.
If we talk for long enough, you start realizing one pattern here, which is you'll be saying something profoundly wise, and my face will start doing this, which is when I thought of something completely nonsensical that I want to throw in, and I'm trying to decide if it's worth interrupting you or not. Because you said, "Oh, my definition of an anthropologist is a very simple thing. I bear witness and I suspend judgment." And I thought, can only do one of those. I can do the first, cannot do the second.
It takes some work, but it takes a lot of humility and a lot of bruised and scraped knees because I have made every mistake possible under the sun.
So when it comes to the way they, so you also said, it depends on how you define storytelling. So do they have a definition? Do some of these cultures you've been with, do they think of storytelling and stories as a separate thing as we do now? Or to them, do they even have a word for it? Because I can imagine some cultures probably don't have a word for it. They might call it something completely different that is not, doesn't have this idea of this separate type of communication.
No, there are many words for it. I mean that these languages are so sophisticated that they actually become very precise in their description. But there is no separation between storytelling and the rest of their lives. It's no different from breathing or eating. It's just part of their existence and an integral part of their existence.
So I'm just trying to, and again, I know you lived with a whole bunch of different peoples, so there's obviously not one answer that covers all of those things. But the image that we usually sold is the whole, the tribe around the fire type of thing.
Mhm, mhm.
And is there, have you witnessed more ritualized versions of storytelling that would perhaps be a little more in line with some of the storytelling we see nowadays, which is in speeches, in presentations, in actual storytelling shows? Because I know some cultures do that. There is this version of the storytelling as entertainment, or as something bigger that gets done around the fire. But is that something you actually witness in your travels?
Yes, I mean, before we even begin, when we go into the circle, and the circle is oftentimes around a fire, and in terms of rituals, one of the things that's very commonplace, that before anyone even speaks, whether it's in New Zealand or Hawaii or parts of South Asia, you begin your story or whatever you're going to share by talking about where you come from and who your ancestors are, because that's the way that they begin to frame and really understand who you are. which is very interesting because in our modern society, we never really talk about where we come from necessarily. We talk about experiences, and usually, they're wrapped around our identifications of who we are. Well, I'm a this or I am a that, and I've got a degree from this. That becomes our professional genealogy. But these cultures are not interested in that. They really want to know your familial ties because that tells them, it informs them about who you are in terms of your perception, how you were raised, how you see the world, where your perspectives come from. And I think that's really fascinating.
It's interesting because it's something that to us, to our generation, I'm not sure to your generation, but definitely to my generation, it the idea is almost offensive that you should introduce yourself by not who you are and what you've done, but by who your parents were or who your grandparents were. So I think today there is this resistance to this idea that, my surname matters, or the, my class or my family, because I think perhaps we've associated a lot of these things with this more antiquated or more traditional social norms that are that are, over the last few decades have become less relevant in most Western cultures, at least. And the idea that, who your parents were should matter when we're going to listen to you, I think I can feel myself resisting it. I know I can see the beauty of it on one side, and the other side is like, no, no, my dad has nothing to do with this. I don't want my dad to have anything to do with this.
I think it's a really important point that you raise because I can see both sides quite easily. I think what happens when, and this just comes from, my background in Hawaii, when I'm away from Oahu, which is the most populated island, where people can be a bit anonymous. So they're on the road and they can honk their horn or be a bit rude. You could never do that on one of the neighbor islands because everybody knows your family, they know who you are. So there's a degree of anonymity that allows us to be, where we're not, where we don't have to be so mindful of those considerations. I do completely agree with you. I don't think they're asking necessarily about who our family lines are based on social, I guess a social order of things. But I do feel that there's also a great freedom of not being necessarily contained in a family's narrative. Do you know? For example, my family came from a very small town surrounded by sugarcane plantations. And people told me that I would never be successful growing up, that I should be grateful for any job that I could find in our hometown. And somewhere in me, I didn't believe that to be the story of my life. And I think had I done that or just accepted, their opinions for my destiny to be true, it would have been a very different outcome. And so, to your point, I think that when we are able to spread our wings and to compose a different story for ourselves and compose a very different narrative, all of a sudden, all of those barriers break down. And I'm highly in favor of that.
So here's another intersection that I think is very interesting. You were talking about how in a lot of these cultures you've experienced people start by talking about where they came from, which to them often has to do with their family. I think the modern day version of that is what I call the origin story. So, with a lot of the people that I work with, some people want to become more proficient storytellers. They want to be able to put out content or ideas out in the world in a way that is more compelling, and that's one type of storytelling skill. But with a lot of people, the exercise is figuring out where they came from in a way, and how is that relevant to who they are now. So, if they work in a particular area, what happened in their past that made them passionate about this, or where they learned the skills that allow them to do this. And you often go back to childhood. So the one I often share is this experience about being, I think I was 12 years old, I was in school, the teacher asked me to go in front of everyone and share a story. And then, the students were, half of the students were terrified for me. The other half wanted to see me crash and burn. And then as I walk up to the front of the class, I realize that I am terrified, but I'm also excited because in school I never felt like I fit in. And then I have had this childish notion of, what if they like my story? Could this be the thing that changes everything for me? And then I go up there, I tell a story, and they laugh and they cheer and they ask for more. And while I'm up there, I feel like the most popular kid in the school. And that was my first contact with the power a story can have. And so I often use that story or versions of that story when people ask me this question, that every time you give an interview or in a podcast they ask, which is, tell us about yourself, or how come you're doing what you're doing now, and I didn't need to go back that far. I could have picked other examples from my life, but I often find that you go back a little bit, share a little bit from something from your formative years, and then you can skip a whole bunch of stuff and get to where we are now. And I've seen you do pretty much exactly the same thing in some of your talks, where you shared what happened when you were, I think, 7 years old, and you were talking to the three elders, that the three elders, the female elders that raised you. um, and I find that a lot of people can do that. Like they can do that, and they should do that. They need to share a bit of their origin, so we get a feel for who they are, and what what they're made of in some cases.
Yeah, I think it's very true. And I appreciate your origin story. And I think it's very important. And it's not only the obvious origin story, but it's the stories, it's the more subtle stories that we adopt about ourselves, right? That, for example, when I was in high school, well, when I was going through school, I was painfully shy, and the idea of standing up in the front of a group to speak, we had to do it for speech class in order to graduate. But I put on my best homemade dress, which was not very pretty, and I shook like a leaf. And I had this really interesting quirk that anytime I got nervous or attention was called to me, I turned bright red. So my classmates called me Rudolph, and um, it was not good. But up there, as I was finishing my speech, and all I wanted to do was get down to back to my seat, my teacher said, "Elizabeth Lindsey, get back to the front of the room." And in the front of everyone, she said, "You will never be a success." Now, the point of this story is that in that moment, this 16-year-old whose knees were shaking and who was bright red in the front of a class that she wanted so much to love her, I knew that I had two choices. And the two choices were this: I could either accept that opinion of a teacher and make that the truth for my life, or I could choose again. And I chose the latter. And I started standing up to speak whenever I could. I was terrible at it, but I kept standing up to speak until one day I was no longer afraid. So, like your story, it's the stories that we tell ourselves that are ultimately the most defining and the most powerful.
Well, so two things about that. First of all, if you pardon my language, your teacher was an asshole. It's shocking that someone would say that to a child, let alone in front of a whole bunch of other children, right? It's not like calling you aside, listen, you're a failure. You're never going to amount to anything. That's awful, but it's nowhere near as awful as doing it in front of the classroom, right? And the second thing is that you said earlier that you grew up next to the sugarcane plantation, and there was this expectation that you would never amount to anything. So that's one destiny story. The other destiny story is the one that the elders told you was going to be the destiny. So I think to a great extent what you've done, and what anyone who does this exercise of figuring out what their origin story is in a way choosing our destiny backwards, because we know where we are, and we're now looking back into our past and saying, okay, this works for me, either because it confirms where I am, or because it was such the opposite of where I am now, that was a motivation for this. Like, everybody told me one thing, but the opposite happened. That's one way of playing it. The other one is, everybody told me this thing, I never listened to them, and now when I finally listened, I'm doing this thing. Right? So they were right all along, and I was an idiot. So that's kind of my version of the origin story. In many ways, is I should have figured this out when I was 12, but it took me until I was 40 to figure it out. So yeah, in a sense, we are, writing our destiny backwards when we do this type of stuff.
That's really fascinating, Francisco. Thank you for saying that. I made a point of writing it down.
Yes, I think you do need to, COVID needs to go away. You need to start traveling more. I think your lack of exposure to really interesting people and cultures is starting to tell. Uh, um, so there was something I've seen you do when you were telling stories on your TED Talks, which is something I do. And I was curious if you picked it up from modern storytellers, or from um, native storytellers, which is telling your stories in the present tense.
Yes, they do, because they being the cultures, because everything for them is alive in this moment. And this is the moment for them that matters. So they tell their stories in the present moment. And thank you for asking. I mean, rarely do people ever even bring that up. Uh, but it is a powerful process, because even for you, you meaning us, it allows us to be back in that moment that then starts to bring that moment alive.
Something almost anyone probably asks or suggests is, maybe sometimes, instead of having the heroic, um, inspiring story of the elders and your destiny when you were 7, you could just start your presentations telling people how you became Miss Hawaii. I think that would give them a completely
That would
different
not be a
feeling.
great story. I mean, the truth with that one is that my father got very sick when I was in my first year of school, and so I was taking myself out of school because we couldn't afford it. And a friend said, "You know, Elizabeth, there's this scholarship pageant. You probably could never win, but if you could place as a runner up, then you could get back into school and work part-time." So that was my goal, was just to place as a runner up so that I could stay in school.
Maybe I'm very cynical, but I'm not. See, this is another way of playing your origin story. Is that once you've experienced and were the winner of one of the stupidest cultural traditions our civilization has developed, you decided that there's got to be a little more to tradition and culture than this. Let me go explore the world and find it, because this is just nonsense.
And I mean, it's also a very generational thing, because you and I are in different generations. So I grew up, where this was part of, what I saw. And I didn't have, great dreams for myself. I mean, my elders saw something quite unique, but I didn't know how I'd get from there to there at all. And so it wasn't a straight line by any stretch, and I meandered and bumbled a lot. But luckily, there was wind in my sails that carried me in spite of myself.
Yes, no, I can imagine. Again, congratulations for winning. I can't imagine that it's easy to win one of those things, but the contrast there, it's just delightful.
Well, it's also funny because I never ever talked about Miss Hawaii, and then I became an explorer at National Geographic. And when you go through a vetting process, everything is available. And I thought, and so one of the heads at National Geographic said, you know, Elizabeth, it's who you are. It's part of your story. Just let it be there. And that was the first time I actually publicly put it anywhere, because I felt that they were right. And I do believe that transparency and even things like this, as we laugh, it makes us somehow more human and relatable. I wouldn't enter the pageant now, but at the time, wanting to be back in school, it mattered.
Yeah, I think that that part of it, anyone that has any issues with, if they thought that you were somewhat, obsessed with your appearance and you want to be crowned as the prettiest or whatever that they consider the Miss Hawaii to be, I think that part sells it. So if it says if this was your way to get back into school, then I think
Well,
that's.
I mean, anyone who knows me knows how clumsy I am in high heels. So nobody had any great faith that we were going to pull this one out of the hat. But yeah, yeah, I think all of what we bring to the table that makes up our story can be very interesting.
So, one thing you have said before, it's definitely in one of the TED Talks, and I think you might have said it in interviews as well, is the line was, when an elder dies, a library is burned, and libraries are ablaze all around the world, which is beautiful imagery, but a very sad reality.
Mm.
So, what the work you do is obviously one of the ways to try and stem that, but with all the goodwill in the world, you're one person.
Yeah.
So is there something that, if you could have a magic wand and convince people that this is a thing that they should be doing, and not necessarily just with native civilizations, but across the board, what is your suggestion or correction or fix or whatever that would help us, save that knowledge? What do you think needs to be done?
Well, it's a fantastic question, and I thank you for asking it. Um, with technology now, we are in a position that we've never been in before, where we can record so easily on something as simple as a mobile device. And so, what I encourage people to do, and regardless of whether I'm, because many cultures throughout the world now, even some of the most, you know, rural areas, have mobile devices. So I'll be in South India, and I'm encouraging young children in South India who are quite poor, if they don't have mobile devices, use a pencil and a paper and go and sit with your family and your grandparents and ask them questions about their lives. Because I believe that what we have to do is simply be recording in using whatever we have available in order to make sure these stories are not lost. We cannot assume that we can just wait a bit longer because people are passing away, especially now with COVID. So that's my encouragement, is that everybody start to record their own stories. I mean, you and I are immersed in this, but there are many people that haven't really even thought about the stories that define who they are. But to record their own stories and see the fascination of their lives and the wonder of their lives, and then record their loved ones, whether it's their children or their parents, it doesn't matter. We must record our stories.
I think the challenge there is this obstacle that I often come across. And I just yesterday I recorded an episode with Alison Kusser, who's someone who works a lot with nonprofit organizations. Before COVID, she did that around the world. So I'm not sure if she calls herself that, but I called her a traveling story hunter. And she said that the problem for most people is that they just, because they're living through their lives, they don't tend to consider those as particularly worthy stories. And and I come across that all the time. It's just the hardest thing for most people is to show them this thing you're just doing now, this thing you just did last year, there's not one story, there's hundreds of stories there, but that overall your life is a story that there's a lot for other people to learn from or to find entertainment in. That's definitely the case of my life usually. um, but it is worth it. And I think if you convinced everyone you need to record your stories and gave them the phone to do so, most people would have, a blank file after a year, because they would still go, oh, nothing happened, right? I haven't got anything to share. When something really good happens, I'll share that story. And I think that's the challenge with most people is they keep expecting something fantastic, when, to most of us, in someone else's life is fantastic, ours not so much.
But let's dig down a little deeper than that, because we live in a world of social media, and we are seeing that people, I mean, inherently people want to be seen and heard and know that they existed. They want their life to have some meaning. And so we see more than ever that people are telling their stories. They may not be the kind of stories that you and I are speaking about right now, but they're posting images, and clearly there are, we can argue both sides of this around, whether the stories are real or whether they're projected and how they'd like to be perceived, right? But the fact is that more than ever, people feel like they do not want to be invisible. And what we must do as storytellers, as story um, encouragers, as story generators, is that we make it simple for people to start to see that even this slice of a moment in their lives is a very interesting story, and make it easy for them to tell it. I think your post that I discovered on social media does just that. It encourages people. It continues to amplify the importance of storytelling. People, it's just a shift and a reframing of our references and our perspectives that say stories are easy to tell. Turn on the camera and tell us a moment in your life that was you know profound, embarrassing, hilarious. It doesn't matter. Just tell us. If you know so that people don't get to the end of their lives, because I hear this a lot, because I'm generation at least ahead of you, but people are saying, Elizabeth, I feel like I may pass from this life with the music still in me that hasn't fully been expressed. Now that's really sad. So how do we address that? we start we start to tell our stories.
Do you remember what story of mine was the one that drew your attention?
No, you know what I found? I mean, I don't even know how it popped up because I'm still very new to the platform. And so I don't know how the feeds come through, but all of a sudden yours did, and you were speaking. And I thought, and I saw a story. And so I went on and started listening to you. And I thought, who is Francisco? I'm gonna
Is it, is
find.
it, is this by any chance the one about me destroying the water tank in my father's house and
I
having?
think it was. I think it was. But right after that, I went and sent you a direct message because I thought I need to know this man.
So one of the things we touched on a few times now is, I never thought of it necessarily that way, but I've been on somewhat of a quest or a mission to prove to myself and to other people that almost everything can become an interesting story. And if you look I mean, that one doesn't fit quite that criteria, because that was somewhat fantastic, having 20,000 liters of water pouring inside a house. But the vast majority of the stories that I share, I mean, one that was one of the most popular I ever told on LinkedIn was about me messing up an IKEA wardrobe. That was it. The whole story is essentially me, like, trying to put this monstrosity together because I can, and then it's just like the whole thing just it's just wrong. And everyone has had that experience when you decide that I can do this, and then you waste 2 days doing it, and you almost kill yourself, and then you still do it wrong. And like, to the vast majority of people, if I ask them, do you think that you assembling IKEA furniture is worth a story, they will go, no, it's not. But it is, a conversation with your kid is often worth a story. A conversation with your partner that you didn't have might be worth a story. So and you could argue that perhaps because we've been cooped up for almost 2 years, barely getting out, that these are the stories we can tell, because I'm not living great adventures traveling around the world, and neither are most people. But even if we could do that, I tend to find that the smallest moments tend to be the most relatable. So in a sense, the smaller the moment, the bigger the potential audience, because you haven't put in traveling around the world or living with sea nomads as a point of break between your story and mine, because it's hard to relate to those things.
Yeah.
If you frame it incorrectly, I'll listen to a story about a sea nomad thinking this is like the Lord of the Rings. But depends on how you frame it. It's like, oh yes, they're just families trying to do the right thing, and they're following some traditions. My family has traditions. I can relate to that. Uh, I'm sure they have weird uncles too. So
But I understand what you're saying, and you make a very, very important point, because it's those small moments. But I think what's essential is that these conversations encourage people to just toe dip into the water. They don't have to dive into the deep end of the pool, but just to start to test the water out. And because of COVID, I think COVID is a great gift to all of us, because most of us are closer to being homebound than at other parts of our lives. And so what we're doing is we're excavating the stories that are right here before us, and they can be as simple as you're building an IKEA wardrobe, or my moving into a house and not being able to find a spoon or a fork to eat with. These are simple stories, but to your point, the more intimate our stories are, this the more human our stories are, the more relatable they become.
and there's something else that I might start boring myself and my audience by talking about so often, which is that it not only every little moment can potentially be a story that someone else will learn from, but perhaps more importantly, they can be something we will learn from. Because if we're examining our lives with this idea of there's probably a story I can tell here, when you're going to do that, you have to figure out, I mean, not your friends necessarily, but if you're doing that in a context like social media, like business, you do need to find some sort of point or moral of the story or lesson in there. And how often are we finding life lessons on our day-to-day lives for ourselves? Like, most of us are not. Like, you're not learning necessarily on a day-to-day basis. And if you're learning, you're learning externally, right? I did a course, I read a book, I watched a documentary. How often does someone say to you, oh, I spent 20 minutes trying to put together this story about something that happened to my kid, and now I've learned something about myself and how I am as a parent, and what does that has to say about my childhood. Like, it never that never could that conversation has never taken place.
Wouldn't it be fantastic if we became, as your friend was talking, as you were referring to her as a traveling story hunter, if we became lesson hunters in life? I mean, like life lesson hunters, because there are lessons embedded in these moments, in lots of small moments. And we just haven't developed, at least I haven't developed, a real keen muscle to recognize them.
Yeah, yeah. No, I'll after we're done recording, I'll share a practice with you that I think you find very useful for developing that muscle. I'm not going to talk on the record about that one because I just did it in the last episode, but I'll tell you after. Um, So there's a couple of other things I wanted to ask you before we done. One of them is particularly when we're talking about native peoples, how do we avoid what could be, I mean, I don't know if this happens now, but there's two sides of this equation. One of them is think of them as primitive, which I know you're very much against, and I think most reasonably thinking people today should be against. But the other extreme of that continuum is to romanticize who they are. Is this idea of, uh, and I'm thinking now, for example, of the whole, the paleo movement, right? So all of a sudden we need to eat like cavemen. And then all of a sudden everything the cavemen did is how human beings, well, maybe we don't want to be like the cavemen in the vast majority of things in our lives. Maybe they had some things dialed down, but not everything. And I think that there is a bit of a trap there when we talk about the wisdom of native civilizations and peoples, of talking as if everything is absolutely fantastic. And I think to some people it clearly is not. There are things that are problematic, and if that's not perhaps addressed, it might diminish the other part of the message. Is yes, but, and you're not talking about the other thing, so I'm not sure I can trust your judgment there. So how do you navigate that with some of the stories that you've shared about this people?
Yes, I mean, this is a very, very good question. It's a beautifully sophisticated question. I have seen cultures and spent decades living among cultures that have been altogether dismissed, if not at the very least marginalized, and acculturated and colonized. So they haven't been given their due. I recognize that there are problems within cultures. All cultures have, certain challenges. And so without romanticizing it, I think that there is a gap between our marginalizing cultures or our romanticizing cultures. And in that spectrum is the truth of what exists, and being able to really bear witness, to see all of it without judgment. But as much as possible, I mean, suspending judgment is not an easy exercise, but as much as possible to see where they're struggling and hold a compassionate heart, and also to recognize their brilliance, knowing that they have been overlooked and marginalized for so long, and wanting to call to attention the sophistication of their cultural intelligence and technology, while recognizing that they are struggling in certain ways. That becomes a very fine needle to thread. But I do my best, from moment to moment. Also, I'm very mindful of the fact that they have entrusted me to tell stories, because that that's both a privilege and a responsibility. So, for example, with the expeditions that I lead, I pay for all of my expeditions because I do not want any of anything that we've recorded to not be held in trust for these cultures, so that it's not compromised, so that their stories are not broadcast on some network or some channel that then re-edits it in a way that is not intended to be.
So let me follow that sophisticated and thoughtful question with one that might not be that. What happened to our elders? Because our elders are kind of rubbish now. Now, you've met some good elders. I think a lot
Mhm.
of the elders we have in our society, and perhaps I'm being unfair to my mother-in-law, but you know, I in for it's through almost two podcasts running that I've done that now. But I look at my parents, and I look at my parents-in-law, and I look at all the people that I know that are of that generation, and I'm not finding that wisdom. I'm not finding that I'm like, oh, okay, another 20, 30 years of emotional and spiritual and intellectual growth, and hopefully I'll be that way. I'm like, no, you're you're still kind of selfish and petty and superficial in many ways the way I am. Like this is not looking good. What's happened there, Elizabeth?
The problem is, you know, the generation that you're referring to and the people that you're referring to probably haven't had the modeling that they needed to in order to become elders. And that's part of the problem. In a modern society, we have all sorts of prejudices against becoming an elder or elderhood or eldership. And especially, I mean, I can speak to, because I live in the US, that there is a real proclivity. There's so much attention paid to being youthful, to looking youthful, to being young, and we dismiss or almost put on the sidelines people who are aging. I mean, there's a definite prejudice on ageism. And so what happens as a result is we don't have a lot of role models for great elders. We don't have the kind of reverence that I see in other cultures where it's actually a privilege to have an elder live with you. This is a whole nother conversation because it's so complex. But there's an acculturation that goes on within our own cultures, within my generation, the generation of your in-laws and your parents, that we do not have the kind of modeling that's necessary to become a better elder.
Yeah, I think there is clearly an obsession with youth and how people look, and with my full head of hair and my flawless bronze skin, I think that is just there's completely unnecessary and shallow, and I think people shouldn't focus on those things. um,
Yeah, if everyone was
but
so lucky to be an Adonis like this, I think the guy.
This is just good lights and makeup, people. Don't get carried away. The hair though is for real. Um, but I do think that trying to be one like have one clear focus and nothing else and bring everything back to stories. I think that you're completely right. They haven't been trained to be elders, but also we've completely divorced. Not only that they haven't been trained to be elders, but our society has disconnected wisdom with age. And perhaps one of the reasons
Yes.
for it is it's because we stopped being storytellers. Because my grandfather, um, well, both have passed now, but the one I had a closer relationship with, he was 100% a storyteller. Now there were only about 7 stories
Mm.
that he repeated over and over, but he did have ways of imparting whatever wisdom he had, which was less than he thought. But still, I mean, he would sit us down and tell stories from his past and from his professional life. That was the way he communicated what he knew and what he wanted us to learn. But there's not that many people that do that. And I believe that if you do that, and if you know that you're expected to do that, you might be slightly more concerned about what is the wisdom that I have to impart. If no one is expecting you to teach them anything, or share any type of knowledge or wisdom, then why bother acquiring it in the first place if it's not for your professional or personal benefit.
Well, I think that's a very good point. But here's another thought in that supports what you're saying. We don't value wisdom the way we value success or achievement or, wealth. Can you imagine if we reframed and found wisdom to be noteworthy? People would be clamoring to be wiser, you know? And so it's just the way, I mean, and here's something. The word wealth comes from the word wella. It's Middle English. And its origins, the origin of the word wealth meant well-being. Now we've extracted the meaning of that word and narrowed it down to currency. But can you imagine if we reestablish the origins of the word wealth and well-being? I believe that storytelling and the value of that guides us to our wisdom is essential, and all of a sudden wisdom would take on a whole different meaning,
I agree, and I also think
and
people
we would
undervalue.
strategize.
I think I agree, and I also think people undervalue how much making people laugh is an art that should receive a lot of money. And I, without being a stand-up comedian necessarily, I'm pushing for that on stories and making people laugh. That's my those are my missions.
It's true. Well, I mean that lightness, we're all seeking that, right? We're all seeking joy and meaning, and I wish that wisdom to become a part of that equation.
All right. On that note, I you mentioned that you're fairly new to the platform we met on, which is LinkedIn. So if someone wants to find out more about the work you have done, which covers a very we didn't even talk about the award-winning documentary you did about Hawaii, the peoples of Hawaii. We didn't cover a whole bunch of stuff that you do, but what is the best place for people to go if they want to find out more about what you have done and what you are doing now?
LinkedIn, for sure. It's where I'm
Okay.
now spending more of my time, or elizabethlindsey.com. And
Okay,
that
perfect.
would take them to LinkedIn, but elizabethlindsey.com would be the right place to go.
Perfect. I'll put that. I'll put that on the show notes. And I told you, I think just before we started recording, that I had a feeling this podcast episode would sound a little bit different than some of the other ones you
By
recorded.
far. So much fun to be with you, Francisco.
Elizabeth, thank you very much for your time. This has been tremendous fun.
Thank you. I feel the same way. Thank you for having me.